Hi, it's Rob from the Bush and Bulkun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint Éowyn, Shield Maiden of Rohan.
So the first colour we're going to use is Citadel Rhinox Hide. We're going to use this to do her boots and most of her armour too. So that's going to be the gloved hands, the wrists, you've got the armour down the forearms there, and then the chest and obviously the leg bits here, and then the boots. Now the first thing that I noticed about this miniature when I started painting with it is the size of it. The scale for the Middle-earth miniatures is considerably different to the likes of 40k or Age of Sigmar, so they are incredibly small in comparison. Might get a shot of some of the Age of Sigmar and 40k miniatures next to these ones because I didn't realise how tiny they were until I started painting them. So now I'm going to use some Citadel Caliban Green. We're going to use this to do the front of the shield and also the cloak. Now looking at the pictures, the cloaks are quite faded in the film. They're not a very vivid green, so I've gone for a green that when it gets lighter looks a little bit faded and maybe a little bit more faded, but it still gives a nice green once it's done. Next up is a little quick layer of doing Kislev flesh on the face. It's another thing that I noticed about the Middle-earth miniatures. There's not a massive palette involved in each one unless you really want to go to town on them and do tons of extra details and things like that, which you could do because they're very, very detailed miniatures. But the palette size isn't that big, to be honest. You can tell by the length of the video there's not that many colours used on it, or that many layers. But the miniatures themselves are really, really good. So you probably will see some Uruk-hai in the coming months. We've got plenty of those to paint. So next up is going to be Citadel Dawn Yellow. I'm going to be using this to do the base layer on her hair. There are certain parts on this video, I think because of the bright hair colour against the dark undercoat, does wash out the colour a little bit when the lamp is on it. So there's a few little sections in this video where you might not be able to see it quite as clearly as would a light. But despite my efforts at trying to get that to have the right colour and the right brightness, sometimes it did just go a little bit too bright. So next up we're going to be using Citadel Leadbedger. We're going to be using this to paint the chainmail and some of the buckles and things like that on the armour. Another good thing about the size of these miniatures is the proportions are really good on them. They're not heroic scale, they are very much an in proportion miniature in terms of like the hands and the head and stuff compared to the body sizes. And the equipment that they're wearing and things like that, they do seem to be very well sized and scaled. I'm quite impressed with them. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Liberator Gold. We're going to use this to paint some of the details like the end of the scabbard there. You've got the crosspiece of the sword. I'm also going to use this to do the shield boss in the centre of the shield there too, just to make that stand out a little bit. I'm kind of trying to follow the colours that are on Éowyn's armour, looking at the pictures from the film, got some stills from online, and working along those lines to try and get it as close as I can, within reason. So I'm going to use Stormhost Silver on the blade of her sword. Ordinarily I'd use Model Air Chrome, but I thought I'd give the Stormhost Silver a go just to have a look and see how that works in comparison. It does seem to do a decent job. Might need to give it a layer or two, depending on how that goes on. It does streak a little bit, but not too bad that I wouldn't use it again. So you probably will see Stormhost Silver popping out every now and again. The sword blade done, we're now going to use a little bit of Vallejo White. We're going to use this to do the two horses on the shield. Now the good thing about this is I don't really mind too much if the white is a little bit streaky. When you look at the whites and the colours in the films and things like that, and I suppose setting wise, when you're looking at the colours that are on kind of like shields and stuff like that, or the whitewash that they used to use on castle walls, it was never perfectly white, it was always slightly streaky and uneven. So I'm quite happy that that's kind of covering the fact that the white never goes on quite as smooth as I'd like. So just using a little bit of Citadel Mephisto on red just to paint the inside of the mouth there. Once you've done that, we are now going to move on to Citadel Reichland Flesh Shade. I'm going to start shading with the face. You want to put a reasonable coat of this on. You don't want it to go on too dark, because Éowyn does have quite a fair skin tone. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Cassandora Yellow. I'm going to put that on for the hair. Like so. I'm going to use a tiny little speck of Carrowbird Crimson. This is just to do the inside of the mouth. Like so. Now we're going to go on to Citadel Nuln Oil. We're going to use this to go over all of the armour and also all of the chain mail as well. It's got quite a nice mail coat on there. So give that a decent coat, that'll dull it down, it'll let the metallic show through, and also darken up all those recesses between the links. Next it's going to be a little bit of Citadel Baneblade Brown. We're going to use this to do the reverse of the shield. It's not a bit that you see very much that. I realised that I hadn't painted it when it came to do some shading. So we're just adding the Baneblade Brown now, and then we can go on to shading that. Now we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Agrax Earth Shade. I'm going to use this to paint on all of the golden sections. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Gore Grunt of Fair Contrast. I'm just going to use this to do the back of the shield. And the contrast do quite a good job of getting a nice brown in there, getting in the recesses. You get plenty of the pigment in those recesses. Now for parts of her armour, she has this nice kind of deep red leather, like around the gold plates, and a couple of the straps too, and on the scabbard of her sword. So we're going to go over the Rhinox hide, which has already been washed with Nuln Oil. We're going to go over the Rhinox hide of the scabbard and around the gold parts, just with a little bit of Citadel Contrast, Flesh Tearers Red, and that just gives that leather a nice hint of deep red. We'll go over that a little bit later with another red contrast. Now it's time for the shield and the cloak, and we're going to be using Citadel Athonian Camo Shade. I'm going to be painting the shield and the cloak in very, very similar colours. Just going to be highlighting them in a slightly different way so they look different. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Nuln Oil Gloss. I'm going to use this on the blade of the sword. I'm going to start working on the face now. I'm going to use some Citadel Kislev Flesh. I'm going to start painting the face slightly off camera. Well done. When you're painting the face here, you want to be using a very thin brush. I'm using my Army Painter Wargamer character brush straight off the back because the figures are a lot smaller than 40k. And so I'm trying to keep all that detail, not go over any of the shades or anything like that. Fortunately, slightly out of focus there, sorry. Now we're adding a little bit of Vallejo white to the Kislev flesh. I'm going to start highlighting that skin. Be thinking about where the light is coming from and highlighting those areas. So the top more than the undersides will be getting the highlights. Now I'm going to use a tiny spot of Vallejo white. I'm going to put a little spot of that into each eye. So as always, you want to be dragging the brush away from the nose to get a nice line where the eye is. A lot harder to do it on these miniatures because the faces are that little bit smaller. But I do redo the eyes a couple of times during this video. Now going on to Citadel Dawn Yellow, I'm going to start reapplying it to the hair. Trying to get the main lumps and bumps that are sculpted onto the hair itself. Unfortunately, this is slightly off camera. But you can see a lot of the ridges and the lumps in the hair, and you want to be highlighting these areas and leaving the shade in the recesses. So now that you've got those bits done, we're adding some Vallejo white to the Dawn Yellow. I'm going to start adding really thin streaks onto the hair. What I'm doing here that you couldn't quite see is where you've got like that one streak of hair that's coming down, like sort of like one little ridge sculpted onto it. I am trying to add thinner lines so you get a couple of little vertical lines. You won't be able to see it during this part because the lighting was washing out the colour a little bit. However, later on you will notice that the hair has got a lot more stripes in it, or a lot more white lines in it, than it has the ridges in the hair. So returning to Citadel Caliban Green now, and we're working on the cloak. We'll be thinking about where the light's hitting it and adding the green to those crests in the material and leaving the shade in the recesses. Like so. Now we're going to use some Citadel War Flesh, which is a nice highlight tone for the Caliban Green. We're going to use this to do the highlights on the cloak and also on the shield. Now on a cloak you want to be doing about 2/3 of the area that you did with the Caliban Green. So keeping it to the crests as you have done, leaving the shade in the recesses. And when you're painting up the shield, I'm kind of doing a little bit down from the top edge of each piece of wood, which is going horizontally across the shield. And I'm just doing the highlights at the top of those rather than all the way down, so you should see them as the miniature is turned around. I'm going to use some Citadel Warboss Green and mix that in with the War Flesh just to get a nice little mid-tone of those two colours. I'm going to do another layer of highlights on the cloak here. Now this is probably doing about maybe 1/3 of the area that you put on with the War Flesh. Again, making sure that you're keeping it to the top edges and the areas that are going to be catching the light. The same with the shield is getting the top edges of those pieces of wood highlighted, which you'll see as it's rotated round. Now I'm going to use a little bit of pure Warboss Green from Citadel. This is just to do some edge highlights on the greens of the cloak and also on the green of the shield. Now we're going to start working on the leather again. We're going to use some Citadel Rhinox hide. We're using this to redo the leather. Now you're going to try and get it in between the ridges on the outside of these panels. And also there's like a little recess where you can get a really thin brush down there and get some of that Rhinox hide back in. Also make sure that you leave the areas around the gold plates with that red contrast paint on them. I've mixed a little bit of Citadel Mournfang Brown to the Rhinox hide. We're now going to start highlighting those areas that we've just applied the Rhinox hide to. We'll also be using this on the boots too. I have done the cloth. There's a little bit of cloth coming out from behind the armour on the forearms, between that and the green underneath the chainmail on both arms, and I've done that the same colours up to this layer, but we're not using this layer on it. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Rakarth Flesh. I'm just going to do some final highlights on the boots and the armour. The reason I'm doing this is I'm just putting on some scuffs and angular lines. If they've been riding through hordes of orcs, the front of those boots is going to be quite badly scuffed, so we are just applying some scuffs to the front of those. Now we're going to do some light highlights to the other parts too, but just put a few little almost like slice lines and things like that on those bits of leather. So now I'm just going to use a little bit of pure Mournfang Brown. I'm going to use this to paint the cloth in between the armour and the green there, and a little bit on the other side too. This is just to break up the colour a little bit and so it doesn't blend in with the rest of the leather armour. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Blood Angel's red contrast, and we're going to add another little bit of red to these areas around the gold. You see that red is showing up, it's very dark, but it does show up there because that's slightly washed out light a little bit. It's not really the best to show it up, but it does have a nice deep red to the leather. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Mournfang Brown, mixing a little tiny bit of Citadel Rakarth Flesh with it. I'm just going to do a quick highlight on these little bits of sleeves between the forearm armour and that bit of green cloth that comes out from underneath the chainmail. Just going to use a little bit of a layer white now. We're going to do her teeth and also work on the two horses on the shield too. Like so. Next up, we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo Black. We're going to do the pupils in the eyes. Now I think this is the third time that I did the pupils in the eyes, so they have had quite a few bits of Vallejo white going onto the eyeball to cover up some wild eyes that have been on there. Something ginormous and staring. That's a bit sturdy. But if you do get them like that, you can use a little bit of Citadel Reichland Flesh Shade and just shrink down the size of the whites of the eyes. So now I'm going to use some Citadel Liberator Gold. I'm just going to start reapplying this to the gold on the scabbard. Also a little bit on the top edges of the little gold plates in the armour, and also onto the top of the grip of the sword. Also two little gold bands that go around the grip of the sword and the pommel as well. Now I'm trying a little bit of Citadel Stormhost Silver instead of Model Air Chrome, and I've mixed that with the Liberator Gold to see how that looks. It doesn't work too bad, so if you have Stormhost Silver, you don't have Model Air Chrome, you can use that to mix with a bit of Liberator Gold to get a nice shiny highlight on there. Now I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Balor Brown. I'm just going to use this to lightly dry brush across the wood effect on the back of the shield, just to bring out a little more colour on there. That just makes those wooden panels on the back look that little bit more noticeable. Final thing we're going to do, or one of the final things I should say, is going to use some Citadel Lead Belcher. I'm just going to put the rim onto the shield. Now it's not actually modelled onto the shield. If you've got a wooden shield like this, you do want to have the metal band running around the edges of it, just to kind of hold it together and make it that a little bit more secure. Just going to put this band on. Like so. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Nuln Oil Shade. I'm just going to put a layer of this over the band around the edge of the shield. That will dull it down, so it's not as bright and shiny as it otherwise would be. And that is Éowyn. So this is the finished Éowyn. Really happy with how she turned out. It's my second Middle-earth miniature. I'm quite pleased with that. But learnt a lot while doing it, a few little different techniques and things like that. But it's a really, really good miniature. Really good one to paint if you have it.
Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media linked below. Thanks very much.
If you like the channel and you enjoy the content and you'd like to support us, our Patreon and Ko-fi pages are linked below. Thanks very much.